Welcome back. This is the second video on the history of the markets during my career, what it was like to be a financial advisor in my 30s during the first 10 years of the new millennium. Of course, we're starting at the top this time. If you remember, we had just escaped the great Y2K fear. And I guess because of all the preparation, there were no riots, there was no market crash, and we eased into the new millennium and ended with the NASDAQ at 5,000. My 20s were full of unexpected events and challenges as a financial advisor. And a lot of professional advisors, such as myself at the time, felt that the markets were toppy. But that concern was not new. Like we had talked about, that concern had been going on for several years. But in my experience, it's rarely the thing that everyone's watching that will send the markets reeling. Nope, it's almost always the thing that comes right out of left field. Yep, that fastball that came out of left field was coming in hot and loaded with all sorts of problems. Recession in Japan hit. Greenspan finally started to raise interest rates. Cash and tech companies had finally started to dry up. There were years of spending for Y2K readiness, crazy advertising costs, and, $6,000 shower curtains. All right, this is about the time we're going to talk about how far down from the top we are and how far down we have to go. It's a little slippery now, isn't it? Yeah. We've got quite a downhill right now. Woo. Yeah. Better watch your step. Woo. This is the slippery part. Have to be very careful. Things happened very quickly. When they talk about the tech bubble bursting, they do mean burst. Within 1 month, the NASDAQ lost 34%. By the end of the year, the NASDAQ would be minus 40%, back down to 2470. We're still going down here, so I got to be careful. But as we open 2001, I'll mention another gem, Enron. In January, Enron was about an $80 stock. By October of 01, it was zero. And I won't get into all the evils of skilling and lay. Just know this, that before this happened to Enron, they were a Wall Street darling. They weren't one of these dot-com no money making debacles. This was a well-respected blue chip company, coined America's most innovative company. And just poof, gone. If you sit across the table from me and tell me that you have your wealth and financial being concentrated in the company that you work or worked for, I will break out into a cold sweat. Your income, your stock options, your 401k, your pension, everything, no. I sat across the table from quite a few retirees who were asking for help that had lost everything in the collapse of Enron. It hit us hard in Texas. And those conversations left a mark on my soul that if you ever meet me and we talk about retirement planning and investing, you'll know how important diversification is to me. You will never be considered unfaithful by making your family and your financial well-being your priority. It doesn't matter how great that company was to you while you were working for them or how wonderful you think they may be. Always put yourself and your family first and diversify. It is the prudent thing to do and the road to happiness. Well, 2001 just gets worse. Was a Tuesday morning. I was in my weekly branch meeting at 7:30 in the morning before the market opened, and our operations manager burst into the room wheeling our one television in the office on a wheeling cart into the room and said, "You have to stop what you're doing and watch the news." You know what it was. It was September 11th, and we were under attack. And remember, it took us a while that morning to figure out exactly what was going on, what the severity was, and the New York Stock Exchange commissioner wasn't sure if he was going to open that morning, but he did, and 20 minutes after the market opened, the towers fell. And I got to finally visit the New York Stock Exchange in 2013, and I walked from the exchange to the 9/11 memorial. And it's striking how close it is, how close everything is in the financial district. The markets remained closed the rest of the week. Colleagues and I just kept coming into work because we didn't know what else to do. It was such a somber time. And I have friends now that worked downtown at the time, and they said when they were going to work, the only smiles that they saw were on the wanted posters of missing people. We called investors and talked about so many things. We called our friends and family, talked to each other, and watched the news. Markets were reeling around the world. They were open, we were closed, just sitting there with a black eye and a broken heart, wondering what was going to happen when the markets reopened. Word finally got around that the markets were going to be able to reopen on Monday the 17th. Warren Buffett went on 60 Minutes that weekend and said he was not going to sell a share on Monday, and as a matter of fact, he was going to buy. A lot of people did feel that it was their patriotic duty to buy stocks that morning, and we actually did have a little rally at first. The reopening of the stock market back then was really important to the American psyche. We had to prove that although we were down, we weren't out. The rally didn't stick, and the Dow ended down 14% that week. And really, we were still looking for survivors at that time and just trying to breathe in and out. Being down 14% was a relief, quite frankly, that it wasn't more, and that it was only money. Well, here I am in the low point in the valley. You can see the peak way back there. And this is a good time to say that at the end of 2002, just 3 years after the NASDAQ high, it ended down 75% at 1335. It was brutal. It was, in fact, the NASDAQ did not return back to its high of 5,000 for 15 years. So I'm switching over to the Dow Jones, the other popular measure of the stock market. Because when investors refer to the first 10 years of the new millennium as the lost decade, they're referring to the Dow Jones. Y'all ever see Art Cashin on CNBC working on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange? Yes, he's still there, and he's one of my favorite people. He started his career young, like I did, at 23, and he's over 80. And he is, to the financial world, what Betty White was to the rest of the world. We love him, and he's not allowed to go anywhere. During this decade, Art became known as the Dow 10,000 hat guy. The New York Stock Exchange had a huge party in 1999 when we finally went over 10,000 on the Dow. There were streamers and balloons, and yes, hats that said Dow 10,000. Well, Art, being the brilliant smart aleck that he is, would go on to bring out that hat every time the Dow crossed 10,000 for the next 10 years. The Dow just kept going up and down and up and down, and we'd turn on CNBC, and sure enough, there'd be Art again with that stupid hat on, reminding us that the Dow had not gone anywhere. He actually said in an interview that he wore that hat 67 times before the Dow finally crossed and stayed above 10,000. But wait, we have to go back a little ways to finish up the decade. Back to 2006. Things were starting to look much better. We were climbing back up, and we hit a peak in the Dow of 14,000 in November of 07. Whew. This is it. Another peak. Isn't it beautiful? I just want to savor the beauty and just remember what the markets were like in 2007. Because what came next felt like financial death by 1,000 cuts.
The president just gave a news conference just a few seconds ago in which he's telling people to calm down. He's reassuring people about our banking system. How do you respond to that?
I'm pretty pissed off right now because I got here at 4 o'clock in the morning. Now they're telling me I can't go in.
What about your faith in our system of banking? Has that been lost?
Well, as long as we have FDIC, as long as FDIC doesn't go broke, we're fine. But what do they do when that happens? You know, two or three more bank runs, I don't think anyone's going to have very much confidence.
Subprime loans, mark-to-market accounting, the housing collapse, and then Bear Stearns, the most iconic company on Wall Street, collapses and is sold in a fire sale to JP Morgan for $2 a share after it had just been trading at $170 the month before. Anxiety back then was so high. And not just because markets were crashing and the housing market was crashing, they were. But it was deeper than that. The very foundation of what we thought was solid and dependable was falling apart before our very eyes, and we didn't know who would be next.
The Chancellor has said, don't panic.
So did the captain of the Titanic, and that went down.
I'm not panicking, I'm being totally rational. I'm just moving my money somewhere else.
By September of 2008, the government seized control of Fannie and Freddie because they were riddled with mortgage defaults. A few days later, Lehman Brothers collapsed, and the government decided not to bail them out because they said it would create moral hazard in the banking industry. But then the very next day, AIG collapsed, and the government bailed them out because they were deemed too big to fail. Merrill Lynch, just very shortly thereafter, failed and agreed to be bought. Actually, I think they were forced to be bought by Bank of America. And just a few days after that, we're still in the same month, Washington Mutual was seized by the FDIC, and it was the largest banking failure to date.
Washington Mutual has gone under, seized by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation on Thursday. The FDIC then turned around and sold WAMU's thrift banking assets to JP Morgan Chase for nearly $2 billion.
The collapse of Washington Mutual started in earnest what is being called a silent run on the banks. People were withdrawing all the money out of every bank down to $100,000 because back then the FDIC insurance limit was $100,000 per depositor. And people were taking out lots of cash and concerned that it was the 1930s all over again.
The Federal Reserve noticed a tremendous drawdown of money market accounts in the United States to the tune of $550 billion was being drawn out in a matter of an hour or two.
Of course, large withdrawals like that just exacerbated an already large ongoing problem. Wachovia was next on the chopping block, and they were only saved by a forced sale to Wells Fargo. I had a friend who actually worked at Wachovia at the time, and everybody was so worried. Wachovia was in the news, and she called clients that morning and said, "Don't worry, we've been saved. We were just bought by Citigroup." And by that afternoon, she had to call him back and say, "Well, no, actually, it's been changed to Wells Fargo." She was busy that day, but things were happening that fast. Goldman Sachs was next, and they were only saved by a $5 billion cash infusion by Warren Buffett. That ended up actually being a brilliant investment by him, the way he organized it, but it took an additional $10 billion from the government to save Goldman Sachs. In the midst of seeing titans fall and dazed employees walking out of buildings at night with boxes of all their office belongings, I worked for Morgan Stanley, and our stock, which had just been at $50 a share very recently, plunged down to $6. It was only years later in an interview that the then Morgan Stanley CEO John Mack admitted that Morgan Stanley was hours from insolvency and going under as a company. Mack said that the Treasury Secretary at the time, in his words, begged him to sell to J.P. Morgan for $1.
Go back and forth, back and forth. She comes back in about 3 or 4 minutes and says, "Tim Geithner's on the phone and he wants to talk to you now. Tell Tim Geithner to get..."
And he refused. And instead, he worked out a deal with the Japanese bank for a cash infusion of $8.5 billion to save the company. Morgan Stanley also went on later to take government money of an additional $10 billion. All of this cash infusion by the government from the taxpayers to the financial industry set up what is now known as the Wall Street versus Main Street fight. And no one, especially me, is saying that these companies deserve to be saved. And in fact, a lot of taxpayers were relieved that we didn't bail out the bad actors like Lehman Brothers. But not bailing out Lehman Brothers created a waterfall effect that wasn't predicted at the time. Pension funds that owned Lehman bonds really suffered, and confidence plunged to such an all-time low around who would be saved and who wouldn't. TARP was created, and yes, the main objective of TARP was to bail out the banking system. But TARP was not free money, it was a loan, and the taxpayers had collateral. We, the people, invested about $236 billion in about 700 banks during 2008. A lot of people weren't crazy about that. The auto industry was bailed out too, making up about 20% of TARP money. Remember, we almost lost GM and Chrysler too. And everybody was asking, well, why should we pay for their mistakes? Yes, the auto industry made some mistakes as well. But everything just felt like Armageddon at that moment. And the idea of letting the auto industry in America go in a waterfall cascade like the banking industry, liquidating everything, losing all those jobs, the pensions, it was too much. The concern was that we would go from the Great Recession to Depression real fast. So it was done. It's real easy to be a Monday morning quarterback and think about all the things that we should have seen, the things we should have done differently. But the fact of the matter is, the TARP program closed in 2014 with a profit back to the government of $15 billion. Those years are hard for me to revisit, but they're important to remember. Nobody got everything right back then, including me. But I talked to my clients constantly, and we tried to balance our long-term faith in the system with unprecedented debacles that were coming at us left and right, not knowing what to trust. We made plans and we talked constantly about how to adjust. Talking to my clients every day back then kept me sane. It kept me focused. I needed to be strong for them. And I remember at one point it actually switched and they started calling to check on me. It was absolutely as tough in my industry as I've ever seen it and as I hope it will ever get. I can only talk about what it looked like inside my industry because that's where I live my life. But seeing your country seemingly fall apart before your very eyes, while at the same time being responsible for the financial well-being of dozens of families and having the ground shift underneath your feet daily, was something that not all advisors could handle. And after that time, quite a handful of advisors did leave the industry. That's good timing. I was just about to say, listen to him, the coyote. I just saw him walk by. Yep. He's saying what I was going to say, that I don't think any generation escapes a crisis. In fact, we're lucky if we just get one or two, but we can always look for the helpers. And there's always a bright spot, no matter what. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. I'm so glad we saw him. That really made me smile. So my 40th birthday was February of '09. And that was when the Dow hit an all-time low of 6,500, or down 55% from its high. The NASDAQ was down 75% from its high on my 40th birthday. Good times. But here I am, almost 54, and I survived. We all survived, and the Dow is now over 30,000. And the lost decade between 2000 and 2010 was really just in the Dow. Other parts of the market actually did quite well. To me, the lessons of the first decade of the new millennium are diversify, diversify, diversify. And it's important to make more decisions with information as it comes in, as opposed to emotion. And that planning and communication are paramount to success. Thank you for coming along this beautiful hike with us and listening to my stories. And thank you, Mike, for being such a good hiking buddy.
Of course.
Keeping me safe.
You're from the coyote.
That too, yeah. He was pretty close. He was really pretty too, and talkative. Anyway, it's important to remember both the good times and the bad. They both provide lessons that we can use for today and in the future, and they also help provide perspective. I certainly hope that I don't go through another decade as interesting as 2000 to 2010, but I know I'll have some more stories, and I can't wait to share them. We'll see you on the next one. Welcome to the Rhino Investor Educational Series. Like and subscribe to charge along with us.